So, as you know, last Sunday, it all emerged that, pardon me, that Farage and Dominic Cummings had been having secret meetings, shall we say. Not only that, but at the recent Cheltenham race, Farage had been, shall we say, whining and dining some uh, big, shall we say, players in the Conservative world on this front. So it had put the cat amongst the pigeons. Not only that, but the Sunday Times reported, as we went through at the time as well, that there were plans to get rid of Kimmy Badenoch. That there were coup plotters in place to get ready to get rid of her. And since Sunday, not a lot has been made of it. Not a lot has been made of it. It's barely really been talked about. There hasn't been too much talked about on that front. So we're going to sort of see now what the actual Conservative response is to that article. And this response is being sort of put forward by ConservativeHome, by Henry Hill. And Henry Hill here is taking, in this response, is responding on behalf of Conservatives. And Henry Hill, especially in the Conservative world, is like almost the go-to guy for Conservatives or news shows if they want someone who is not from the Conservative Party but involved in that Conservative world. So it's very, very interesting to see what he thinks to this whole idea of, quote, uniting the right, because as far as he is concerned, it is in neither the Conservatives nor Reform's best interests, or in their short-term interests, shall we say, according to him, to currently unite the right. So let's get into this and see what actually, according to him, because the way that he's worded this article, he is like speaking for all Conservatives in this. So it is kind of interesting to sort of have a look at it from that point of view. And of course, I do recommend, if you haven't seen the video yet, that you watch what that article was about from the Sunday Times. The video in itself is called The Tories' Worst Nightmare. Farage, so Cummings, Farage, and a Big Plan. So if you haven't watched that, I would go and watch it. It's about 43 minutes long, though. Like I say, it was a lot to cover in that video, and of course being talked about before. So there is a lot to cover in that. But if you haven't watched that, like I say, it will give you a grounding, of course, to understand what's going on in this video, and of course what Henry Hill is responding to in this. So bear that in mind if we bring up stuff from that video. So, but before we do go on into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button down below. Of course, there are links to my Patreon page, the donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, the Pony Club, of course, down below as well. And of course, twas Wednesday yesterday. So please do, of course, go check that out if you are a member of the Patreon or the Pony Club. Like I say, that video will be there for you to watch. So let's crack on then into this. So, this comes from ConservativeHome. It is neither in the Conservatives nor Reform's short-term interests to unite the right. So, bear in mind, I get the impression that Henry Hill has written this as like a Conservative response because not too many people in the Conservative world have actually really responded to that. They've sort of gone, it's out there. They've not been, shall we say, too much response to it. And this is sort of, I'd say, the first serious response to this article, especially from like someone like Henry Hill, who is a sort of a Conservative, as we said, is fielded as someone who is a non-member of like the parliamentary political Conservative Party, but is in that Conservative sphere. So interesting to see him stepping up to the plate to sort of respond to this Sunday Times article. So let's kick this off then, shall we? So, in the Sunday Times, Tim Shipman reported that a group of, and I like this, former officials of Vote Leave, presumably, are currently plotting to oust Kimi Badenoch as the Conservative leader. And of course, the staunch local election losses via a pact with Reform UK. In the article, they said, this weekend it can be revealed that a significant number of senior Conservatives are, of course, concluding that if Keir Starmer is now the current favourite to win the next election, it should be stopped. Farage is a horse they will have to put their money on. MPs, donors, and of course former party aides have all been meeting in secret to draw up a campaign to, quote, unite the right. And even moderate Tories are now prepared to see Farage as Prime Minister to stop Labour. So, as an aside, it would be interesting to know which moderate Tories are suddenly up for the idea of Nigel Farage as Prime Minister. Presumably, none of those whose priority was, as recently as November, backing whoever was best to able to block Robert Jerrick. Anyway, the shippers continue. So, yeah, Henry Hill makes up a very good point. The last Conservative leadership election was all about stopping who would be the best candidate to go up against Nigel Farage, and able to block Robert Jerrick. He makes a very good point. And remember, Henry Hill is not a Badenoch fan. Henry Hill was a Jerrick supporter in this. So he is right. Who are these moderate Tories that are suddenly completely fine and okay with, Prime Minister Farage? Because just a short couple of months ago, they were terrified and horrified at that idea and have seemed to continue to say that idea would be incredibly bad for the UK. So Henry Hill certainly questioning, should we say, the sources of who these, quote, moderate Tories indeed are. So the Unite the Right campaign, as the article continued, said that the campaign will be explicitly agnostic, where this now means cooperation on shared policy areas such as immigration and non-aggression pact, so that each party can focus on their seats. A formal electoral pact is not a full-blown merger or even a takeover of the party by one by the other, indeed now to maximize support. One model being completely openly discussed is, of course, the relationship between the German centre-right parties. The Tories and Reform should become the CDU to CSU, a former Conservative advisor said. So, as Henry Hill responds to that. So, such discussions are not bad. Insofar, they are now focusing on the medium to long term. If Farage can hold his party together and maintain at least a semblance of share in the position in the polls, Reform will secure a serious parliamentary breakthrough at the next election. If that happens, it will probably become the default right-wing option in large parts of the country. So, first of all, we must heavily remind you, even though Farage occupies this large section of the polls, since the last general election, they have won 12 seats. 12. Out of 200 plus by-elections, they've won 12. And I keep on bringing this up because for all this talk of how popular Reform UK is meant to be, doesn't really seem to be winning that many seats. But bear in mind, in the run-up to last election, we saw the Lib Dems win, we saw Labour win as well. Until people can actually show that Farage actually can win, it is nothing more than a paper tiger. And until that evidence is there sitting in front of me, and I will gladly say, okay, here's the evidence. Now we can panic about Farage. I'm not worried about it. So, Henry continues. At that point, of course, the question probably is then what form of arrangement is then worked out with the Conservatives. How long that takes, of course, to do. I've taken, of course, as 3 baseline scenarios. New Zealand, independently, but usually cooperative. The Alla Nationals, and of course, New Zealand First. Australia, separate parties in now a permanent coalition. And of course, Canada, a full merger. The Progressive Conservatives and Canadian alliances. The CD US model is a little bit more left field, as reform is now emerging heartlands are rather more dependent on a more diverse and dispersed than, of course, Bavaria. And maybe, of course, that works too. But all of this are now for working out, of course, after the next election, not before. Reaching, of course, a formal agreement ahead of the 2029 general election makes very little sense for either party. For Reform, the obvious question is what they will gain by actually formally linking up with a party which only just left office courtesy of the most shattering rout in its longest history. This is especially the case because nearly all the seats in which it placed second last July are held by Labour. An alliance with the Tories might put them over the top, but it would take a much harder line for Farage to actually woo angry voters who are now bitterly disappointed with this government, but still remember how bitterly disappointed they were with the last one. Again, it makes a very fair point. Very fair point indeed. The next fight at the 2029 election, Labour and a lot of Labour MPs in the north will be fighting not against the Tories, but against Reform. And that is something we have to remember, especially up here. So the Conservatives, of course, meanwhile, would be playing with 2 fires. First, of course, a deal now would lock Reform in as a major player at the next election, when it is by no means impossible, which it is likely to say, that the wheels will come off the Tamil war machine even before that debate. Which is again true. I've said this many times. I always bring this up as a counter argument. Do you seriously think Farage will be able to keep this momentum going? Bear in mind the absolute dramatic fallout he's had with Rupert Lowe. And the fact that a lot of people in Reform, especially the grassroots, very disappointed because they thought Rupert Lowe was going to take over from Farage. So there's a lot of disappointed people in Reform. Will that actually hurt them in the upcoming local elections? Who knows? We'll find out. We'll find out that not too soon. So, even of course, in its current sad state, the Tory party has a lot of institutional advantages over its challenger. Not least, of course, it does remain bigger, at least in the Commons, and likely, of course, in actively campaigning members, at least for now, and richer. Although how richer, we'll see. Like I say, that is still a big question. How much funds does Kimi Badenoch actually have in the bank to play with? Whole lot of rumors and stuff swirling around by, shall we say, Conservative Party finance on that front. At that, of course, same time, formally linking up with Farage means at least tacitly endorsing all the people Reform ends up selecting as candidates, which would be a courageous decision, especially if its treatment of Rupert Lowe has now scared off people of real ability and experience. And oh boy, if you just saw the other story that came out this week about the guy who is in charge of vetting candidates at Reform, yeah, I'd be worried too about who exactly they are, quote, choosing. Because as we saw, really during the last sort of Conservative government, after Brexit, Boris Johnson pretty much pushed out everyone who was, had ability, who had experience in government. They left the party and others went and sat on the back benches because they just didn't want to get involved. And we saw how bad that party went. Do you think Reform, gathering up this random gaggle of people who have never been involved in government in their entire life, who've never had any experience with the government, how it works? Do you think Farage has any idea how the government works? No, he's never been in charge of anything like that in his entire life, which is why he is so set up to fail quite spectacularly. And that is why, if it does ever get in, I can guarantee you this now, he will blame the blob. He will blame the civil servants, not his own disastrous policies that he tried to enact. Anyway, back to this. It will, of course, make it very much harder for the Conservatives to woo over Labour voters in the bits of the country where the two are, of course, going to go head to head. And, of course, increase the risk of incumbent Tory MPs getting picked off by well-organised Liberal Democrat and Green campaigns. So, good on Henry Hill for actually recognising the Liberal Democrat threat here. Now, he does also mention the Green because, again, the Greens did take 2 seats from the Tories in this. Will they be able to actually build on that momentum? I will tell you this now. I don't think so. I keep on telling you this. The Greens are not a serious political party. I've explained that many times. Look what happened during their last, big event. Look how many people, especially in the party, are fuming about the fact that they now have to support HS2. Look what happened when the Green Muslim, this new group, came out of nowhere and almost trashed their entire manifesto promises in and around Gaza. They are not a serious political party. And I say that still. Even when they've got 2 co-leaders, that doesn't make sense for our politics, to be honest. But there you go. I'm sure Zach will love being the Conservative leader. Oh, by the way, I'm still in that chat. Anyway, a danger, of course, not to be underestimated, given that this is, of course, now the most marginal Commons since 1945 in terms of seat majorities. So 4 years is a long time, of course. Exactly, it is. 4 years is a very long time. I do not think things will maintain the same for Farage. Things will change between 2029, when we're due to have that election. Things will change very, very much so on that front. Or at least would be so his 4 years off is a long time. Significant changes in circumstances could, of course, very much shift the balance of the agreement in favor of a pact well before 2029, or at least late enough, or an official and unofficial divvying up of seats and campaign resources could come from the campaign itself. But however unshakable the impact amongst parts of the Conservative Party, that the answer is always a deal with Farage. Both of the parties should remember that the big winners at the last election were Labour, with 211 seats plus, and the Lib Dems with 64 seats plus. And this is only by peeling away voters from those parties that the right can hope for another Commons majority. And I will tell you now, if the Conservatives do a pact with Reform, Lib Dems benefit. We've explained this so many times. All those Lib Dem wins came because the Lib Dems had peeled off Conservative voters who did not like the fact that the party was going in this really hard right direction. They did not like that, they could actually see a pact with Reform happening. And remember, there's still that floating voters, those missing voters, that missing 10%. Where did they go? Will they suddenly reappear at the next local election? Because they didn't vote Conservative, they didn't vote Reform, they didn't seem to go vote Lib Dem or Labour either. And for a group, especially that traditionally always goes out and votes Conservative, which they are from, just to have a missing 10% from them is really strange. Really strange indeed. And it's not because of COVID that they died off. They're still on the electoral register. They just didn't vote, which is very interesting, certainly, when you look at that voting turnout for all that stuff. But that's something that does tend to get missed out on. And remember, the whole reason that Lee Anderson was brought in to be like the deputy chief whip was to get back that missing 10%, and he failed to do that. So what happens to that 10%? Who knows? It doesn't look like it's coming back anytime soon. That's for sure. Anyway, so let's finish this off. It is at least very likely the case that the Tories in Reform appeal to very different parts of Labour's 2024 votes and would do the most damage in election time by trying to maximise their distinctive appeals. But that very, very much mitigates against a formal pact, at least for now, at least. So we will see what happens. We will see what happens on this. But I think Henry Hill is right from a conservative point of view, as he's coming from. Why should you take this so far? Doing one now is pointless. There's not a lot in it for them currently. Even if they did, they would be scaring off a lot of voters because not a lot of people want to see Nigel Farage as Prime Minister. Because remember, we've always got to remember that the 2019 election, one of the big reasons why Boris Johnson won so much was because of the fear that Jeremy Corbyn might be Prime Minister. So a lot of people who would vote, or maybe have voted Lib Dem, voted Conservative. What's to say at the 2029 election, if that fear gets spread about Nigel Farage in the way that it was about Jeremy Corbyn, regardless of policies and what they were actually saying, could that happen again? It's possible. It is entirely possible for that to happen. And we forget about that. That's happened before. That people did not want to see Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister in 2019. So they went and voted Conservative to stop that from happening. If these moderates are so against the idea of a Farage, Nigel Farage as Prime Minister, and that pact even happens officially, unofficially, they're not going to vote Reform. They're not going to vote Conservative. They're probably going to go vote Lib Dem. Ultimately. So, interesting times indeed. This is, of course, not the first time we've heard talk about this pact or to unite the right. This has been a continuing thing for quite some time. But with now Reform actually having MPs in Parliament, will they actually be able to continue their electoral success? Bear in mind, what would happen, let's say, in 2029 if Reform wins, but Nigel Farage loses his seat because he's a terrible local MP. Because Nigel Farage is not interested in being a local MP. He's made that abundantly clear. And I don't think the people of Clacton will vote him back in, especially if you've been keeping an eye on local Facebook pages or the Clacton Gazette, especially some very interesting stuff. We should probably do a video about that. Some of those letters that have come in about interactions or trying to get in contact with their MP, their absentee MP, shall we say, on that front. So interesting times indeed. So as always, thank you very much for watching. Please remember to click the like, share, and subscribe button. Down below, of course, there are the links down below, the Patreon page, the Buy Me Coffee link, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the Pony Club as well. So thank you very much to all that and all the people who support that. And as always, we'll see you all next time.